Welcome back to Boiler Wild. My name is Eric Johnson, and on this podcast, I talk about boiler industry topics as well as personal development. WILD is an acronym I came up with and stands for work hard, invest in yourself, lead others, and develop yourself into a person of excellence. This is episode 11, and on this episode, I want to talk about something that is important and something that you should know about, especially if it is required in your state, and that is CSD-1. And you may have heard CSD-1, and you may not know what it's for. I didn't know what it stood for the longest time, or what it was, or all this stuff. It's extremely common in the trades, but around boilers to, you ask somebody for, oh, well, why do I have to do this? Or why is it like that? And they say, oh, it's like that because that's code. Or, hey, this is wrong because it has to be like this because it's code. And my advice for that, anytime that happens, is you then say, oh, well, I want to learn more about that. What code is it? So that I can reference it. And if they can't tell you the code and generally where it is or where to look, or if they can't even tell you the name of the code, then they don't actually know, that they're just repeating what they heard somebody else tell them. Or they're repeating what they think is true, and it may not be true. It's also okay to say, hey, this is like this. It came from the manufacturer. I don't know why it's like this. It must be because of a code when it deals with construction of boilers, or like why you have one fuel safety shutoff versus two fuel safety shutoffs on a boiler, or why you have a vent valve, or where you need a vent valve on the gas train. That all changes based on the size of the boiler, but all manufacturers in the United States are going to follow codes and standards, and they're going to build the boiler to the minimum plus whatever you order it at. So if you just order an off-the-shelf boiler, packaged boiler, and you don't specify anything, the manufacturer will build it to the minimum codes and standards in your area, because you'll have given them like a spec sheet that the engineer will have spec'd, hopefully. And that will basically tell you the minimum, which a lot of them are all pretty standard. You can get into some weird jurisdictions like California or New York, especially New York City, not New York State. New York State has some added stuff, and those jurisdictions will have regulations on top of what the state regulations are and national codes and standards. But let's talk about CSD-1. So what is CSD-1? CSD-1 was made by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, which is also called ASME. ASME. You will probably see it always referred to as ASME. ASME is a giant organization now. They started in 1880, but they're giant, and they don't just deal with boilers. They deal with anything mechanical engineering. The best way to learn about them is just go on their site and browse. I can't even begin to go through everything, but they're basically involved in everything. But for the boilers, ASME wrote the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code in 1915. So over 100 years ago, they wrote that code. And that was to set the minimum construction standards for boilers and pressure vessels. So that Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code is commonly shortened to BPVC, and you will hear people talk about Section 1 boilers or Section 4 boilers, and a Section 1 boiler will be a high pressure steam boiler or a high temperature water boiler. and a Section 4 boiler can be a low pressure steam boiler or I guess normal temperature and pressure hydronic boiler. Low pressure steam, if you're not aware, is 15 psi and less. So if the boiler is stamped at 15 psi MAWP, maximum allowable working pressure, it can be a low pressure boiler, and then that can get an H designator on the shell. But where CSD-1 comes into play? CSD-1 comes into play, it was first made in 1977, and CSD-1 stands for Controls and Safety Devices, and it was written to improve public health and safety near boilers. So issues such as inadequate training and failure to test safety controls are reasons boiler accidents can happen. The boiler pressure and vessel code just sets the minimum construction standards of a boiler. It doesn't tell you like how to do stuff, like, oh, how to check a low water cutoff. It just tells you what's required. The CSD-1, it's not a replacement of the boiler and pressure vessel code. It would be an in addition to. So it's a standard, which is different than a code. But the boiler and pressure vessel code is going to be required across all of the United States that I know of. I don't know anywhere that can have a boiler that is big enough to fall under the ASME, boiler and pressure vessel code, that isn't ASME. There are some boilers that don't need to be ASME, but that's only certain circumstances. But if you're in the commercial industrial boiler space, all of the boilers are going to be ASME. Now, I'm sure there's some weird regulation or rule where ASME is not applied. I don't know that, but for me, in my world, and maybe your world, ASME has been adopted in your jurisdiction, which is all 50 states. It is also used outside of the United States, but I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. So anyways, getting back to the standard, the CSD-1 standard, so it's an in addition to. So only a certain amount of states and jurisdictions have adopted the standard. The CSD-1 standard is not mandatory across all of the United States. There are states that have not adopted it, and also states have not adopted the most recent version. So as of this podcast recording in July of 2025, the most recent version is the 2024 version. But there are some states that will write into law that they'll automatically adopt the most recent version. And then there's other states that will say, we've only approved and adopted the 2018 version or even like the 2008 version. And, you know, it takes legislature and government to adopt a new version of the standard, and everybody knows how efficient government is. So it doesn't always happen that the most recent standard is adopted of the CSD-1 standard, and they can also choose to adopt only part of the standard. It is up to the state's legislatures. And that's what makes working in the United States kind of unique, is that every single state has its own boiler rules, and just crossing a state line, you can have wildly different boiler rules. So you need to be aware of the boiler rules in your state and then any other states that you work in. So you may not live in a CSD-1 state, but if you live adjacent to a CSD-1 state and you get a customer in that state, you now have to know what the CSD-1 standard is and how to apply it to a boiler. So the CSD-1 standard provides clear rules and guidelines for operating and testing safety controls and devices on boilers. and that helps to prevent accidents. The CSD-1 Standard, if you are needing a good resource, one, I would highly recommend if you are interested in the CSD-1 Standard, or if the standard is required in your area, you need to get yourself a copy. Your employer should have a copy. I would hope they have a copy. But you can get a copy online on the ASME site. I think it's $120 or something like that. You can download a PDF copy of it and read it. It's only like 58 pages or something. It's not huge, but it is interesting and you will learn a lot. You can't go wrong downloading a standard and reading it, but your employer should probably have a version of it, and they'll probably pay for a version for you to have, if not. So I would highly recommend you get your own version. So 2024 is the most recent version, and the standard only comes out every 3 to 4 years. I'm not super well read on how the standard committee works, but there is a committee, which is the ASME Controls and Safety Devices for Automatically Fired Boilers Committee, and they follow a meeting schedule. I believe they meet twice a year, and they review questions that people can submit to the committee, and they review any amendments or whatnot. And that's all governed by international standards of how that committee is run. So it's a very formal, uptight thing. It's not just a bunch of people getting in a room just making up stuff. But the CSD-1 standard only applies to a certain amount of boilers. One, it's got to be an automatically fired boiler. And that's basically any boiler, though, these days. Any packaged boiler that you're really going to find is going to be an automatically fired boiler. An automatically fired boiler is a boiler that cycles by its own control in response to a control system. And the control system for a boiler is either going to be temperature or pressure related. So a steam pressure control shutting off the boiler would automatically shut off the boiler, and therefore it is a automatically fired boiler. The CSD-1 only applies to certain boilers. So you need to be aware, if the CSD-1 is adopted in your area or in your jurisdiction, you need to be aware that you only need to apply it to certain boilers. And there's four boiler types that the CSD-1 standard does not apply to. That is boilers with an input rating greater than or equal to 12,500,000 BTUs per hour. So that's greater than or equal to. So anything above 12,500,000 BTUs per hour is covered by NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association 85, which is the Boiler and Combustion Systems Hazards Code. So boilers over 12,500,000 BTUs per hour, the CSD-1 standard does not apply to. The CSD-1 standard also does not apply to water heaters. A water heater is defined as a vessel that heats potable water, limited by local controls and safety devices, to a maximum temperature of 210 Fahrenheit and a pressure of 160 psi gauge. It also does not apply to direct gas-fired swimming pool heaters that comply with ANSI Z2156. And then it also does not apply to HRSGs, which are heat recovery steam generators. So that's the four categories it does not apply to, and that's from the 2024 version. But just be aware of that. You need to know that. Kind of look dumb if you find a 800 horsepower boiler and you say, oh, well, CSD-1 says this. You should be looking at NFPA 85 in that case. All right, so there is a lot in the standard that you can look at, but we want to look at, I kind of divide the standard into two different parts. Some of the standard is the construction, more on the construction side of the boilers, and the other part of the standard is more on the installation and service of the boilers. And on the construction side, a boiler manufacturer is going to have to pay attention to that. If you are a operator or a service tech and you're just ordering a boiler, receiving a boiler, servicing a boiler, the boiler is going to show up to code. A manufacturer will not mess that up. Hopefully they won't mess that up. And if you order it to the CSD-1 standard, it will show up to the CSD-1 standard. So you don't really need to learn that. You should be aware of it and why stuff is. Like I said, it's only like 58 pages, the whole standard. So it's not like you're learning thousands and thousands of pages, but it's a lot of rules that you will never have to really make sure that you are doing. Because if you order a boiler and you have a packaged boiler and it shows up and you maintain that boiler and then you say, hey, we got to replace this component, and then you change a like for like component, like you're not really changing any part of the design of the boiler, or even if you change the component to a similar component that was the same but just a different manufacturer, you're still not really changing the design of the boiler. And as long as everything is like for like, it's going to comply with the CSD-1 standard. The inspector in your jurisdiction also needs to look at the boiler after the install. So if you were to install a brand new boiler, you would have a inspector come out who has been commissioned by the national board, so they're properly trained, hopefully, to look at the boiler. And if the CSD-1 standard applies in your area, then that inspector will be looking for the minimum requirements on the boiler from the CSD-1 standard. A lot of boiler manufacturers will just build their boilers to the CSD-1 standard. It doesn't have tons of extra crazy requirements, and sometimes it's just cheaper to make all their boilers fit to the standard instead of making a special boiler design that you have to change and make different prints for. But I'm not a boiler manufacturer. I'm sure they vary back and forth, but a lot of packaged boilers, the standard option also meets CSD-1. I would say the most important part of the CSD-1 standard that the inspector is going to look for is the field report. And the field report, it's in the back of the standard in the appendix, non-mandatory appendix. That's very important to remember, non-mandatory appendix. And this field report is a suggested form with suggested information with a suggested format for you to fill out. It is not required to fill out that exact form, although most manufacturers and companies fill out that exact form. You can edit that form and make it however you want, as long as it has all the requirements that CSD-1 has. And the requirements is essentially that the form lists all the controls and devices, all the safety controls and devices on the boiler, and then it lists the manufacturer, the model number, and the operational test date. and then if a operational test was performed on that. That is basically what is required on the form. This form has boiler information, safety relief valve information, boiler rating, and then like site information. A lot of the fields don't get filled out. So how this works is if a boiler is built to the CSD-1 standard, a manufacturer will fill out a CSD-1 field form, and you will get that form with the boiler. And if you are a installing contractor, you then have to refill out the form and recheck that all the safety controls and devices are correct and that they are all operational, and then mark the date and then sign the bottom of the form. And that's essentially saying that the boiler left the manufacturer, all the safeties and controls worked, and the boiler was built to the CSD-1 standard. And then after it was installed, it's another check of yes, all the safeties and controls work. You never want to trust that a manufacturer has wired or tested a boiler correctly. I know that seems strange, but they're human as well. But even if they do, there is a semi truck and a trailer and hundreds of miles of bumpy road in between the boiler manufacturer and your location. That wires can come loose, wires can come off. All sorts of stuff can happen. Controls can fail. So that is why you are required to test those safety devices and controls again, and then re-sign the form. That is very important that you do that. It is very important that you don't pencil whip that. Pencil whipping is basically you filling out the form to complete the form instead of you filling out the form showing that you properly tested the boiler. If you just put check, 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 check all the way down the form and sign the bottom, you are, one, you're lying, but two, you're putting a lot of risk on yourself in your company that if anything were to happen, especially right after you fill out that form, they're going to come looking at you and be suspect. And if they ask you a question and say, hey, why did you check off that the low gas pressure switch worked when the boiler doesn't even have a low gas pressure switch? Like, that's going to be a pretty hard question to answer. Not all boilers are required to have a low gas pressure switch per the CSD-1 standard. It has ranges of input levels, input ratings of burners, and that's why you'll see some boilers without a low gas pressure switch or a high gas pressure switch, or one safety fuel shutoff valve versus two safety fuel shutoff valves. And that all depends on the input of the boiler. And if you just check off everything on the form you're given without actually making sure everything works, you're just defeating the whole point of the standard. The whole point is not to fill out a form and show other people that you filled out the form. The form is just proof of what you did. If somebody had a security camera in a boiler room, which is becoming more and more common these days, they should be able to go back and see you checking the boiler properly and completing the form. If they can't do that, even if there's no security camera, that's on you. So that takes integrity. It also takes confidence in knowing what to do and checking it properly. You need to be aware of certain things when it comes to the standard. A main one when you're looking at the installation of a boiler is combustion air requirements. So every boiler that burns fuel is going to require combustion air. And if you have a boiler installed in a boiler room that doesn't have ducted air and there's no static louvers, you're going to have a moving louver that opens and closes when the boiler fires. And CSD-1 requires that moving louver be interlocked with the boiler. And an interlock means that the moving louver needs to prove that the louvers are open before the boiler can even fire. So this will normally work by the boiler receives a call for heat, and the boiler will send a signal, which is power, but it will send a signal to either a relay or to directly to the actuator, and a actuator will drive open a louver and then hit a end switch that's on the louver. It can sometimes be inside the actuator, but it really should be on the louver because the louver sometimes is connected to the actuator with mechanical linkage, and the linkage can slip. So you should really want to always prove that the physical louver is open and not the motor is just in a certain position. But the louver proves open, and now the boiler can proceed, and it will either, depending on the boiler setup, it can sit and purge and wait for the louver to open and prove, or it will start purge and after the louver proves. But that's all just based on how the boiler is wired. But just know that if your boiler goes to light and that louver isn't interlocked, that's going to be a problem. And also know that if you are trying to troubleshoot a boiler and the boiler doesn't want to start and it's just sitting there and everything seems correct, make sure you look. And most boiler manufacturers will put a couple terminals for pre-ignition interlock that will normally be marked for like air dampers or something like that, that you'll have field wiring going to that will go to louvers. And a lot of times the linkage will fall off a louver, or the end switch will get bumped, or somebody will shut the louver because it was cold in the boiler room and they didn't like all the cold air and didn't understand that a boiler requires combustion air. This can also apply if you have fans. So there's boiler rooms that have intake fans. So instead of a louver, you have a air handler that is blowing air into the boiler room. That air handler needs to be interlocked with the boiler and all fired equipment so that no boiler in the boiler room starts without that air handler proving that the fans are running. That is important for combustion air. You don't want to starve a boiler. It will change the oxygen of the combustion, and you can start running into dangerous territory if you start starving a burner for air. Another requirement of CSD-1 is maintenance, good old maintenance. So in the back of the CSD-1 standard, in the non-mandatory appendix, there is a recommended maintenance schedule, which is daily, weekly, monthly, semi-annual, and annual maintenance. And it says who can do the maintenance. CSD-1 basically will recommend that, but it's just a general list that obviously cannot apply to every single boiler. So CSD-1 recommends that you follow the manufacturer's required maintenance in the manufacturer's manual. yes, you should read the manual of the manufacturer. But all boilers require preventative maintenance. There's no boiler that I know of that you can start up and then never touch again for its life cycle. If you have inspection jurisdictions in your area, which most boilers have, you will have requirements for inspection. So basically, most high pressure steam boilers are required to be inspected on a yearly basis in every state that I know of. It may be different, but where they'll vary is hydronic boilers. Hydronic boilers can have inspection schedules of 2 to every 4 years, and a lot of times you don't even need to see the inside of the pressure vessel. A lot of inspectors will vary on what they want, and a lot of hydronic boilers these days don't even have access to see the inside of the pressure vessel. But that's all based on the boiler manufacturer. Back to CSD-1. CSD-1 requires that you have a maintenance plan written out. Normally, I've seen that's basically people just print out the manufacturer's recommended maintenance. They say, yep, this is the plan. Inspectors are pretty loose on that. I haven't been in every single state with every single inspector, but they are pretty loose on the requirements. And don't be surprised if the inspector doesn't know the requirements of CSD-1 or is fuzzy on them. They also don't know everything. They also can be mistaken or wrong if they tell you to do something. So just because a inspector says you have to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. Obviously, you need to be very respectful, but hey, where is that? Like, let's look that up. I believe, that may be wrong or we're not. Like, at the end of the day, the inspectors have the final say, and you have to do what they say in order to get what you want from them. But I've had multiple times where inspectors like, oh, you need to do this. And then I'm like, well, let's look at it. And then you pull up the code and they're like, oh, yeah, my bad. Yeah, I was wrong. Yep, you're right. You're right. It's good. Yep, you're good to go. So that's normally how that goes. Just be respectful. Inspectors make mistakes too. They're not all knowing and all powerful. They are all powerful, I guess, because you need permits for operation from them. But your maintenance, you need to document it and make sure you are doing that. And maintenance on a daily high pressure steam boiler could be blowing down the boiler. And you want to make sure you have trained people to blow down the boiler correctly and safely. And then annual maintenance is required to be done by a qualified individual. And you may be asking, what is a qualified individual? That is an excellent question. A qualified individual is somebody who has been properly trained and regularly services boiler equipment. So if you're a operator that has a state license or a service technician that has been trained, you would be a qualified individual. A qualified individual would not be a maintenance staff person who management said they're now in charge of the boiler. That person doesn't know anything about the boiler and doesn't have the proper training to look at a boiler on an annual basis in the way CSD-1 wants them to. You always want a qualified individual, which in most cases is going to be an outside contractor sending somebody in. Most places I've worked, they'll have people that are knowledgeable about the activities of a boiler on a monthly basis, but the inspection part of the boiler that normally comes on the yearly basis with high pressure steam boilers, that part is going to be done normally by an outside contractor or a licensed operator from the state. It varies depending on the boiler in your situation. It's hard to talk about boilers, codes, standards, because there is so many varying codes and standards that have been adopted by states, and states have all kinds of weird regulations, and then you add in that everybody has different boilers and different preferences, that your facility may be different. And that's kind of why when you read CSD-1, you'll say like, oh, this is kind of vague. Like, while it is very exact, it doesn't say, it's not like super specific on everything, because they can't be, because they don't know what jurisdiction you're in or what kind of boiler you have. You can't write a standard that covers all kinds of boilers. So make sure you are documenting maintenance. That is very critical to proper boiler life. That's also critical for water treatment. You want to be documenting water treatment. That's probably the number one killer of boilers, is improper water treatment. Another requirement of CSD-1 is the installing contractor needs to provide manuals and wiring diagrams. This may seem pretty basic. A lot of contractors may just get lost in the job or forget to send manuals and wiring diagrams. So this is a requirement. You need to send the manuals and wiring diagrams to the owner and end user, and then you also need to have them sign that they received the manuals, wiring diagrams, and piping diagrams. That is important. So on most boiler startups, you will have a kind of a turnover where you will have owner training, and you may be printing off manuals for them, but a lot of times these days everything is digital, so you'll just be maybe giving them a USB or sending them a link to the cloud. But you want to record that, and you want to get a signature that you turned over the manuals, wiring diagrams, and piping diagrams, as CSD-1 requires that. The most important part of CSD-1 for you to learn as a contractor, in opposed to being a manufacturer, is the field report. The field report is what I was talking about earlier, that essentially makes sure that the boiler continues to operate to the CSD-1 standard. And I will talk about that field report tomorrow in part 2, as it's a little bit more in depth, and this has been about 45 minutes already. And I know I seem kind of jumbled around, but the important part about CSD-1 is, 1, that you have a copy of it. 2, that you briefly know what's in there. You will not memorize it unless CSD-1 is your job. There's really no need to be an expert on it. You just need to be able to find information. You'll pick up common information, but there's a lot of tables in there that you are never going to pick up unless you're constantly opening up the standard, which most people don't do. But you want to be able to reference it and check check answers to questions against the standard. And then you just want to make sure that the boiler is operating safely, which the method the CSD-1 standard does that by is the field report. And I will talk about the field report on the next episode. The field report is an interesting one, and it's something that I struggled with to learn because I didn't have any instruction beyond what people were telling me, and there's really no instruction online. And the CSD-1 Standard doesn't tell you, like, oh, this is how you fill it out, and this is what we expect of you. They just say what fields need to be filled out on the form. Secondly, leave a lot of room for error, and that's why I made the Foundations of Controls and Safety Devices CSD-1 learning course. The learning course is available on boylearn.com if you want to check it out. I made that for my past self. I think it's a pretty great course. It is all videos, and the course has a assessment, pre-assessment, and a post-assessment. And most of the assessment is written or like fill in the blank. And there's all kinds of reasons why I do that. I'll get into that on another episode. But we're essentially proving that you're learning something and making sure that you're learning something and not just memorizing answers. Everybody that's taken the course has loved it so far. We've seen huge improvements over the assessments and what people learn, and there's a lot of good downloadable guides. So if you want to check that out on boylearn.com. If you have any other questions or podcast topic recommendations, feel free to email me at eric.johnson@boylearn.com, ERIC.JOHNSON @BOILEARN.com. Thank you for listening. Tune in tomorrow for part 2 of the CS1 Standard, and we'll talk about the field form. Have a great day and stay wild.